Hello and welcome to this webinar of International Trade in 2021. Can multilateralism be revived? And perhaps I should add, can it even prosper, given that we really might be at an inflection point for global trade governance? We not only have a new US administration that's committed to multilateralism, but we also have a new head of the World Trade Organization and 4 new deputy directors. So new energy, new momentum, and then as well, the WTO Ministerial Conference coming up in November. So a lot happening. And again, at the same time, I think it's also quite clear that the rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO at its heart really is essential for ensuring that we have a sustainable and inclusive global economic recovery from the pandemic. And I think it's also clear that we need policies that really recognize that it's women and it's also micro and small enterprises that are driving growth, that are driving the recovery. And then it's also really the most vulnerable economies that have the most at stake and the most to gain from a multilateral approach to global trade rules. My name is Marianne Schneider-Petzinger. I'm a senior research fellow here at Chatham House and delighted to chair this session today that's on the record and part of our Chatham House Global Trade Policy Forum. It's really a pleasure to be doing these, the series of events that we're doing in part due to our funders and the great support that they are providing us, AIG, the founding partner, but also Clifford Chance, Diageo, and UPS as our supporting partners. I'm joined really by 2 stellar panelists, Ambassador Stephen DeBoer, who's appointed Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization in 2017. He joined Global Affairs Canada in 2005, and previous roles included Deputy Chief Negotiator for Climate Change. And again, that is one of those issues that really is not just about climate change, but increasingly also linked to other issues, trade being one of them. So we look forward to hearing his thoughts on that. And then Pamela Hamilton, who has served as Executive Director of the International Trade Center since October 2020. She joined the ITC from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, where she was the director in the Division of International Trade and Commodities. And she previously also served with the Jamaican government and a number of other international and multilateral institutions. So it's a real pleasure to be hearing from those 2 stellar panelists on the key opportunities, but also the key challenges facing global trade. And so Pamela, let me turn to you without further ado to kind of set the scene and what you see when you kind of look at the global trade landscape.
Thank you so much, Marianne. It's a pleasure to be back here at Chatham House, although virtually. In particular, to share this online stage with Ambassador DeBoer. From the earliest days of the WTO, Canada has been a pillar of trade multilateralism, supporting the rules, improving the everyday work of the organization, and building support for new cross-cutting issues like gender and environmental sustainability. In all of this, Canada has truly been a friend of the system. So Marianne, you've given me a few minutes to break the ice. So let me start by putting some home truths on the table. And I'm known for doing that. First, reviving multilateralism is not choice. The theme of today's discussion is, can multilateralism be revived? I say we can't afford not to revive it. Maybe we've all become numb to the statistics of COVID, but while the picture improves for many of us here in Geneva and in the UK, we can't and should not forget the damage that is still happening across the world. COVID-19 has caused the most severe economic crisis since the Great Depression. 500 million jobs lost, investment contracting, poverty rising for the first time in this century. Over 130 million new people projected to have fallen below the poverty line last year alone. The ITC's main stakeholders, small firms in developing countries, have taken a massive hit. Our research shows that the smaller the firm, the further down the pyramid you go, the stronger the negative impact of COVID-19. So there can't be a recovery without global trade. A recovery isn't worth the name if it's unequal, uneven, or unsustainable. And there can't be an even sustainable recovery without multilateralism that is strong and fit for purpose. Second, remember that we've been here before. It's easy sometimes to be daunted by the scale of what lies ahead of us, but let's not lose sight of what trade multilateralism has achieved in the past. I know this because I was there. In the early 90s, I was a young Jamaican delegate to what was then the GATT, one simple, passionate trade professional from a small economy, helping to try to build what would become today's WTO. With my Geneva counterparts, we worked days and nights for years on the biggest negotiating mandate on trade ever launched. Like today, we work through issues that seemed unfamiliar. They cut across old categories and ways of thinking, like trade in services and intellectual property. I saw firsthand arguments within the membership, big and small, that all too often threatened to sink the whole negotiation. We worked through delays, frustrations, and compromises, and we grappled with legitimate concerns that I myself raised in negotiating sessions and committees about whether developing countries would really benefit from any new system and whether they could afford not to be a part of it. Yet the system delivered not just a legal text, but the most profound institutional reform of the world trading system in half a century. Thirdly, we need to seize the day, carpe diem, as they say. In international Geneva, we sometimes talk loosely about historic moments and critical junctures, but no one can argue that we're not living through one right now. The WTO has never been more ripe for a reimagining. This pandemic has shown us all, from the small trader in West Africa to the G7 ambassador in Geneva, that there are such things as global problems that affect everyone. There's always the temptation to go it alone, whether on tariffs or vaccines. But history has shown, for better or for worse, that these global problems need global solutions. The WTO has a new Director General. Much has been made of her gender and nationality, and these are truly historic. But she clearly sees that this pandemic has thrown down a gauntlet to a multilateral machinery all too often set in its ways. I agree with the DG. The way you save multilateralism is by doing things differently. So let me close with a fourth and final suggestion. We need to go from the ground up and we need to go big. A simple phrase, but what does it mean? It means making the system visible to all. The small firms that are the backbone of our economies and our labor markets need help. They need finance, they need access to the internet, they need the tools and training to be financially and digitally literate. It means continuing to flex the WTO agenda. In my time as a delegate, we were still grappling with tariffs. But now the future is the trade and agenda. Trade and connectivity, trade and MSMEs, trade and the green economy, trade and women's economic empowerment. These discussions at the WTO still in their early stages and need our support. It means remembering that for all the talk of trade rules, waivers, high politics, and high wire negotiations, the scarce resources firms able to meet the demands of overseas markets. These firms need data and market intelligence. They need tools to boost their competitiveness. They need links to sustainable supply chains and support from governments with a strategic MSME-focused vision. It means anchoring the WTO in regional integration and vice versa. African capitals are squarely focused on making the AFCFTA a success. What we do here in Geneva has to speak to their aspirations. It means setting an aid for trade core at the heart of any new initiative. The WTO landed the trade facilitation agreement in part because there were agencies like the ITC and others ready to deliver the benefits of this new agreement to developing countries. And it means setting a high bar for what we want to achieve in Geneva and in our beneficiary countries. Having big dreams, plenty of plans, and lots of partners along the way, we look forward to success in the near future and hopefully at MC12. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. This was excellent. Again, a whole range of topics. But Stephen, let me turn to you now to kind of get your sense what the Canadian perspective is on what effective multilateralism looks like. And again, what contributions a country like Canada can make, particularly in light of Canada's efforts in the Ottawa group. So Stephen, over to you, please.
Well, I was going to say thank you very much, and I may disappoint the audience in that there's very little that Pamela said that I would disagree with. But let me say at the outset, this question, can multilateralism be revived? I absolutely say yes, it can, and I agree with Pamela, it must. But I would also say, and I think we need to acknowledge that it is sick right now, and it's in dire need of change. But before I get into the bad and the ugly, I think it's also very important to acknowledge the good. And there are elements of the organization that are functioning relatively well. Committees continue to meet and to advance issues. For example, TBT and SPS committees are effective forums for resolving trade irritants. Trade policy reviews continue to shed light on the practices of members and to exert gentle but effective peer pressure as members consider policy directions. And we've established mechanisms in the WTO to discuss contemporary and pressing issues like trade and sustainability and women's economic empowerment. And I'm proud to say that Canada is playing a very active role in both of these last two areas, including by co-chairing the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, as well as providing strong leadership in the informal working group on gender. So it's not all doom and gloom. But that said, as a trade negotiator, I'm aware that we are largely judged on our ability to conclude negotiated outcomes. And in this context, it would be hard to argue that the WTO is not in serious trouble. Our stakeholders are tired and fed up with the WTO's inability to conclude work. Frankly, so are governments. And I'm getting tired of having to say things need to change. My counterparts are getting tired of saying it. And we know that change is necessary. The question is how or where do we start? But I am optimistic that 2021 provides us with new opportunities to begin making the changes that the WTO needs. In Dr. Konja Iweala, we have a new Director General who's willing to push members to think and act in ways that they previously had not. And this is good. We have a new administration in Washington that has promised a return to a more traditional form of US multilateral engagement and leadership at the WTO, and this is also good. The human health tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic provides us with new opportunities to demonstrate the WTO's relevance. And we have the ministerial conference at the end of the year. We're not short of work. Multilaterally, we need to conclude the long-running fishery subsidies negotiations this year. And here I'm hopeful we'll be able to do so in time to meet Dr. Ngosi's July deadline. We need to advance work on agriculture, and we need to find a credible way forward to reestablishing a fully functioning dispute settlement system. Plurilaterally, we have an opportunity to deliver an outcome on services domestic regulation, advance work on MISMEs, investment facilitation, and e-commerce joint statement initiatives. And we need to make concrete progress on issues like trade and health, trade and environmental sustainability, and on trade and gender. And I would argue the WTO's agenda has never been busier, more diverse, and frankly, more important. And we have real enthusiasm across the membership to address a wide range of issues. But let's be honest, the WTO's problem has never been starting work. Rather, our problem is concluding our work. As I see things, we have two main challenges. The first is to marshal this enthusiasm efficiently and effectively and to try to find ways forward that members can get behind. On the other hand, and this is the second challenge, we need to acknowledge the reality that we cannot do everything all at once. Trying to do so will only slow progress or contribute to continued deadlock. In particular, I'm thinking of the resource constraints faced by smaller and/or developing members. We need to avoid situations where smaller members feel that they're unable to participate, excluded or ignored, as bigger and/or well-resourced members try to push forward. Finding a balance between an ambitious and realistic agenda will be difficult. And this is where the Ottawa Group can add value and hopefully help build momentum behind ideas and proposals. The group's composition is meant to be representative of the broader WTO membership. We can act like a sounding board for proponents of ideas and initiatives. Think of us like a one-stop shop for proponents to test their ideas in front of a representative cross-section of the membership. We also meet with chairs of WTO bodies to discuss ways of helping to move work forward, exchange views with regional groups to try to identify elements of common interest, and provide regular updates to the broader WTO membership on our efforts. Our ministers also hold regular discussions to try to advance WTO causes. Lately, this has included a focus on trade and health. The onset of the pandemic provided the group with the impetus to develop its first initiative aimed to ensuring that the WTO is better prepared and equipped to support global responses to future health emergencies. Our goal is to mainstream this initiative into the WTO such that it can form the basis for work in this area going forward. And looking ahead to MC12, it is vital that the WTO deliver something tangible on trade and health. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated how interlinked we are as a planet and how important stable and predictable trade is in supporting a timely and effective response to challenges of global proportions and importance. This crisis offers the WTO and its members a shared struggle around which to rally and to clearly underline the importance and value we all place on a well-functioning WTO and the multilateral trading system. This will require political engagement and leadership, and you've heard Dr. Ngozi pushing for increased political involvement in the work of the WTO. We need to use international fora like the G20 and APEC to push for action on WTO issues and as catalysts for ideas and new approaches. We do not need solutions to come from these groups. That will not work. Rather, we need them to help generate ideas and momentum. We need to get back to our regularly scheduled biennial ministerial meetings. And to be fair, we as officials need to stop providing our ministers with canned lines that have not changed much in years, and instead start thinking more creatively. We should be prepared to take some risks or to try new things. After all, as the old saying goes, the definition of insanity is trying to do something the same way and expecting a different result. If we were serious about safeguarding and advancing the WTO, we need to do things differently. We need to seize on the opportunity we have to reposition the WTO as responsive, relevant, and credible in the 21st century. This means moving forward on issues I outlined earlier in order to demonstrate to our stakeholders that the WTO remains viable. And speaking of stakeholders, we need to establish more regular, inclusive dialogues with stakeholders, and not just business, but other international organizations, NGOs, academics, etc. We need to adopt new approaches and not be afraid of failure or the need to adjust on the fly. Multilaterally or plurilaterally, the WTO must deliver results. This will require all WTO members, regardless of size or level of development, to engage. And I'm hopeful that we can find common cause necessary this year to begin implementing the change that the organization needs and that we as members owe it. After all, there is no plan B. And might I add to Pamela's point about the early 1990s, it's a very useful reminder. And when you think about what was accomplished in the Uruguay round, it truly was cutting edge. And negotiators were dealing with issues that they had never really talked about before in a multilateral context. And I think when we sit here in 2021, we think of the GATT and WTO negotiations as moving in a smooth trajectory, onwards and upwards. And Pamela knows very well that that's not the way it worked. But I think what's useful about Pamela mentioning the 1990s is that we should not despair, that it was difficult, it will be difficult, but it is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, you've put a lot on the table, and I think also very much, again, highlighted some key points there, and echoing Pamela's remarks that it's not been a smooth process. And again, WTO reform isn't necessarily a single package. There's very different, again, issues and groups, and again, a lot of parallel things that are moving forward. But I think you both also highlighted this tension on the one hand between, having a really big, ambitious, and bold WTO reform agenda, but at the same time, you can't do all at once. So how do you square that circle? Because I think, again, for the WTO to remain relevant, its members have to tackle issues such as trade and climate, trade and health, trade and gender. But at the same time, if you put everything on the agenda, isn't there the risk that it overburdens an already packed reform agenda, and again, potentially undermines an institution that isn't properly functioning, again, with the appellate body currently, out of the loop. So how do you square that circle, Pamela, and then Stephen?
Thanks, sorry, I was on mute. No, I agree. We can't do everything all at once. I mean, I remember talking about motherhood, which is a different story, but very similar. You can have it all, but just not all at the same time. And the truth is that we need to look at the priorities. What is it that we need to get done now? The fishery subsidies is one that has been highlighted. Right now, the issue of the vaccines is going to be on the table because we're in a process which is urgent and which is current. We need to look at the issues of, frankly, development and how many countries have been left behind in this last year, and how do we address those issues. We need to also look at issues of trade and climate change, whether we like it or not. That is the other catastrophe that hasn't rolled out fully yet, but it is rolling as we speak. And how do we address those issues from a WTO perspective? On the trade and gender issue, I expect that there will be a follow-up to the Buenos Aires ministerial declaration. And how do we show that we've made some progress over the last, well, in December, it will be 3 years. And what do we want to do moving forward to address what is a significant problem, and the WTO needs to have a position on it. Let me stop there, but I can come back after Stephen speaks.
Stephen.
So absolutely agree, we can't do everything all at once. We're going to have to create priorities. And I would say, when we think about the next big thing for the WTO, which is MC12, I think there are three easy ones, and not easy, but three that sort of easily come to your mind. And Dr. Ngozi is very much trying to focus our minds. As Pamela said, we do need to conclude fish. I think trade and health needs to be addressed. We can't have delayed the ministerial conference and be in a pandemic and not do something that addresses the pandemic. That seems like an impossibility. And then the third, I don't think we've quite decided what the third is for Canada. We would hope it would be agriculture and issues around food security, something that also touches on the pandemic. But I don't think we've all agreed on that. But I would also say that we shouldn't be doing everything all at once at the same speed. That there are different approaches to dealing with these issues. And so the Buenos Aires Declaration on Women's Economic Empowerment, it had 124 members. It started a process. It doesn't necessarily mean that by 2021 we need to have a multilateral outcome. But we need to show progress. That needs to be a continuing discussion. And a continuing discussion, I think, and this leads to another point of mine, which is a lot of this will depend on how we define success. And if success means that we're going to be creating rules at MC12 on women's economic empowerment, then we will not be a success. But if we've actually advanced the discussion on women's economic empowerment, then I would argue we are a success. From Canada's perspective, some of the plurilateral outcomes, the joint statement initiatives, are very useful ways to advance the discussion. And it recognizes that not everyone in the membership is ready to engage in some of these issues. But for those who are, there is a facility and a forum for that to happen. The other thing I would say, what I'm noticing, and I'm not quite sure whether we're there yet, but I'm not sure that this would necessarily be a bad result. We tend to see the WTO, or we see the WTO as a rulemaking institution. When we think about the JSIs on investment facilitation and on MISMEs, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to rulemaking. It almost sounds like soft law. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is some discomfort within the membership on developing soft law approaches because we're used to developing hard law. and creating rules. But maybe that is a way that the WTO will morph. What if there was a code of good conduct on investment attraction, and countries would voluntarily sign on to it? What positive signal would that send to the investment community that would be good for economic development, that would be good for trade? My final thought, and Dr. Ngozi is working hard on this, and it's something that we wanted to see from all of the candidates who are running for DG. We really want the WTO to step out of its silo. We want, at least in Geneva, to reach across Geneva. We want to talk and have a conversation between the WTO and the ILO, WHO, with the UNFCCC down the road in Bonn. We need to have those discussions. Success for the multilateral trading system will also be our ability to engage with those other organizations and on those issues. And again, I'm not saying that success means that we will have rules by MC12, but starting that engagement, I think, will be very important, and will also be important for the ongoing relevance of the organization.
Before I open the discussion to the participants, and again, I encourage you to use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen to signal that you'd like to come in. Let me give the opportunity to Pamela again to also respond perhaps to some of the issues that Stephen raised in particular. Again, how do you see that relationship between the plurilateral agreements and the multilateral system, and also that issue of the WTO increasingly cooperating with other international organizations?
Thanks so much for this opportunity, because as nodding as Stephen was speaking and thinking about various aspects of it, I think we should never discount the power of soft law, because it opens a window that allows those who can jump further to jump, and those who need to stay a little bit on the ledge and see if they're willing. And it gives everybody the opportunity to take it at their own pace. If we take, for example, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, it was a success because it recognized that people were at different places and different levels. And I think it's probably one of the best, in a sense, innovative adjustments that WTO has made in understanding that the one size fits all, or why is it? It's something we created in Uruguay around. The one single agreement everybody signs on or they don't, that it's not necessarily going to work in a context of now, more than 160 countries or 108. So how do we move forward in a way that works for some, but still addresses the issues about it? And the GSIs are important. So the e-commerce is going to be critical in discussing some of the major issues on the digital divide. And one of the biggest challenges we're now facing, as we realize that inequality has now, in a sense, jumped from analog to digital. And to what extent has that exacerbated development issues that we're now facing? So that's a critical element. I think we have to really look at that and address that. The second issue is on the MISMEs. How do we look at the new informal working group on MSMEs, and how do we begin to incorporate, in the same way trade facilitation incorporated customs officers and others, how do we begin to incorporate the actual players in the MSME world to come to the table and kind of say, well, this is what the reality is for us. These are our access issues. This is what happens when you put export restrictions and it kills our supply chains, and we're not able to make the kinds of trade that we. So these are the kinds of things that I think are important, and so the GSIs do play an important role. And I think we need to understand the role they play and also see how we can build on them in the final analysis to get to where we want to get to. But it is a great mechanism. Stepping out of the silo, absolutely. There needs to be more engagement, I think, across the board in terms of, we work a lot, as you know, ITC with the WTO on several aspects, gender, MSMEs, e-commerce, etc. But I think that we need to start also looking at issues of labor. We need to start looking at issues of course, the wider gender, prognosis and where that is going to go. Need to look at human rights issues. We know that that's going to come down the pike. And of course, the climate change issues are going to be critical. And I think we need to look at those and see also how developing countries are going to be able to manage the breadth of all that is going to be occurring in the next few years. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And again, you mentioned that issue of inequality, and I know that Michael Harvey wanted to come in on that. Michael, are you with us? If so, please introduce yourself very briefly, and you can ask your question directly to Stephen and Pamela. If not, then let me just read out his question.
I'm okay now.
Perfect. Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Right. To what extent does the increasing growth in domestic inequality seen around the globe encourage populism and self-interested economic nationalism rather than promote trade multilateralism?
Fantastic question. Stephen, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Well, that is a fascinating question, and people are definitely starting to engage in that debate. There was a very interesting article by Adam Posen in Foreign Affairs on this very topic. I think what this shows us is that the narrative and the storyline on trade liberalization and multilateral approaches is an ongoing story, and it's one that we need to keep repeating and keep reminding ourselves and our stakeholders the interconnectedness of our world and the benefits that we have achieved because of that interconnectedness and because of trade liberalization. I think when we think about the WTO, to a certain extent, and it's roundly criticized by many, but I think one of the reasons for that is we have we've lost our narrative. We forgot to tell the story as to what was good about the WTO, what we achieved in the WTO. And when things work well, you take them for granted. And we see this in the Canadian context, we see this in the North American context all the time. There are certain things that we expect to have happen with respect to the free flow of goods and services between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And because they work well, we forget why they work well. And we forget that we actually worked hard and created rules and created that environment where these things would work. So we need to constantly tell that story. And I would say that the pandemic has been very useful in that it reminds us that this is a global problem that requires a multilateral solution and a multilateral approach. Before we started this seminar, we were talking amongst ourselves, Marianne, Pamela, and I, about how complicated vaccine production is, and the fact that the Pfizer vaccine requires inputs from 19 different countries. If that isn't a case for multilateral approaches, I don't know what is. But that needs to be the storyline. But I think we got too complacent. And when I think about populism in particular countries, when you look at consumer prices for durable goods and how much they've gone down, the cost of food in many countries and how much that has gone down, or food self-sufficiency, how much that has improved. These are stories that are related to trade liberalization that we're not necessarily telling. I'm not going to say that multilateral approaches are always perfect and that there aren't problems associated with it, but I would, of course, my view from Canada is that overall it is positive, but it's a story that needs to continually be told.
Well, I think in the light of the pandemic, with inequality on the rise, and again, trade offering prospect to contribute to the recovery, there is an opportunity to again reshape the narrative. But Pamela, you're nodding there as well. Do you want to add anything?
Well, not really. I think what Stephen has said is so true. I think we have what I'd like to call a translation problem. And it tends to happen to a lot of us. When I left Geneva 26 years ago, and I got to Washington, D.C., And they were just in the context of looking at the signing, 94 of the Uruguay round and everything. And of course, there was the usual hubbub, and there was the NAFTA. And I remember, the important role that the presidents and the prime ministers took at the time to explain what was happening and what this meant and what NAFTA meant and what the trade liberalization meant and what the opportunities were. And there was a narrative, and there was attention to, I see Jennifer Hillman on the call. There was attention to pointing out, what this meant, how it was going to work for you. There was the, trade adjustment assistance that was also incorporated. So it was a whole approach. I think what has happened over the years, as Stephen rightly said, is that we've become complacent and we assume everybody knows this and everybody should know this. And the truth is, a lot of people just did not know and don't know. And as economic inequality has increased, naturally, people will become resentful. Naturally, they will begin to feel that they're losing out to this big thing. It may not actually be that thing, but that's the thing that they can point to. And I think we need to begin to become more deliberate and strategic about the narrative that we are giving for our populations, for the general public. I think I shudder to say this, but I actually think that Donald Trump was actually good in the sense that he made people ask me what I do for a living. And then he made people ask me if I was one of those people in Geneva who work for this thing. And it gave us the opportunity to begin to point out that when you put heavy tariffs on Chinese goods, then people have to pay more for their washing machines and for all, and it became more personal. And then people began to drill down a little more and understand that the dynamics weren't necessarily what they were being told, that there's a bigger picture out there and that there's more in this. And so I think we need to become more deliberate and strategic about communicating and about engaging the populace and translating what we do.
A very powerful call to action here. We also have a number of participants that want to come in and join the discussion. So let me bundle them. David Henning first, and then Jennifer Hillman, and then we'll go to the next round. David, please.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. Thank you, Pamela and Stephen. David Henning from ESIPE and Borderlex and besides. I'm exhausted by just listening to the list of topics that you have mentioned. But I don't necessarily find reassurance from that at a time when it's really difficult to get agreement. And I actually wonder whether an alternate way forward here is to go back to core principles and actually get member states to sign up to core principles. And I'm thinking here of going back to things like non-discrimination. And then secondly, to consider whether those core principles, whether and how they can survive the work that we have to do in areas like climate change. And I'm thinking here of the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that I worry, never mind, I agree, fishery subsidies has been hanging around too long. But, for my kids, for example, if the WTO or if WTO members think that carbon border adjustment mechanisms are illegal under WTO rules, I think we've got real problems. And I don't think the WTO can survive that. So interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Do hold your thoughts. Let's bring in Jennifer first, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Jennifer Hillman. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and also professor at Georgetown Law. We are very proud to claim Ambassador de Boer as one of our alums from that institution. And it's always great to see Pamela Koch, who
I went to Georgetown Law as well.
Oh, I apologize. Wow, this is like the Georgetown Law panel here. Fantastic. Thank you, Pamela, for reminding me of that. I more have fond memories of our early textile negotiating days. So 2 questions quickly. One is, when I step back and look at what's happening in Washington, sort of 80 to 90% of the trade energy is focused on China and the China trade war. What does it say about the WTO and sort sort of its future if the two largest trading nations in the system are having a trade war that is largely being fought outside of the WTO? I mean, what does that mean going forward? Would you recommend that this continue to be sort of largely outside of the WTO? What does that suggest for it? And then second question is on the dispute settlement system. Do we need to fix it first and separate, or should any fix to the dispute settlement system necessarily be packaged with other institutional reforms?
Really big questions there. Pamela, please, and then Stephen.
Okay, let me start first with Jennifer's question. Hi, Jennifer, good to see you. Should the dispute settlement system be fixed first and separate, or should it be? I think it should be part of an overall institutional approach, frankly. Yes, it needs to be fixed, and it actually has had a significant impact on, in a sense, the credibility of the WTO for this to have been almost shut down. But I think that the new GG has asked for an overall institutional review of the WTO and how it's functioning and the Secretariat, etc. So perhaps it might be better taken in that context to see how, first of all, the Secretariat is functioning and a review of that. And then meeting with the relevant member states, the US being, of course, one of the big ones, to see how we can readjust or retool the dispute settlement system in a way that addresses the concerns that were raised, and some are legitimate, of course, and then putting it in as part of a whole new approach to the WTO and how it functions. In terms of the China trade war, it really would be better, and we all know this, if it were occurring in the context of a rules-based system that the WTO manages. And we're hoping that with the new US administration, that it will come back into the fold, in a sense, come back into the framework of a rules-based multilateral system that both have signed on to. And in doing that, then it once again addresses or engages within the WTO in a context that hopefully can find a resolution that is long-term and that is sustainable. It's not good for it to continue outside the WTO, let's put it that way, because it does kind of render the WTO seemingly ineffective or irrelevant to the biggest trade issue that has occurred over the last 5 years. David, to go to your question, the core principles issue, we could go back to non-discrimination as the major core principle, and would the WTO survive if it's felt that climate change regulations are not WTO what's the word? They're not in keeping with WTO rules. But I think that we've, in a sense, gone past that and this is why it's so important for the WTO to, as Ambassador DeBoer said, as Steve said, to get out of its silo and also to kind of reimagine itself for a 21st century reality. The carbon border adjustments, all the things that are going to come down the pike require, in the same way that GATT needed to be reimagined for issues like services, like intellectual property rights. Those were things that were unimagined at the time. In the same way, I believe this is now time for the WTO to begin to look again at these new issues. So I'll stop there.
Stephen?
Wow. Well, let me start with David's question, because I don't confess to understanding it completely, but let me try to take a crack at it. And I guess I would say this, that yes, non-discrimination is one of the fundamental principles of the multilateral trading system, but we have also proven ourselves to be able to negotiate derogations or to negotiate around some of these non-discrimination principles. If you think about the GATS schedules, for example, and how they operate. So we have these principles that most of us hold very dear, but we also are capable of approaching these in a flexible way. It's not to say that we shouldn't be having this discussion, but on its face, you can imagine carbon border adjustment measures being in serious violation of this principle of non-discrimination. But I can also imagine ways where the membership could envision some flexibility around these particular issues. So it's not an impossibility, I would say. But I'm somewhat taken by your question, because there are times when I sit in General Council and I hear some of my colleagues talking, and I think, wow, we've really strayed far from what it is that I thought we agreed to in the WTO. So there is something that appeals to me about having a crash course with all ambassadors to say, by the way, this is what you signed on to in the WTO, in the Marrakesh agreements, because we tend to fight and pull apart our pet parts of the Marrakesh agreement and not look at it particularly holistically. But I think when you do look at it holistically, you understand and you appreciate that there are built-in flexibilities, or there are flexibilities that the membership are willing to contemplate. To Jennifer's questions, I find it funny that Jennifer introduces herself. Everybody knows who Jennifer Hillman is, I thought. But anyway, it's nice to see you, Jennifer. Of course, for countries like Canada, we would like the US-China disputes to be talked about in the context of the WTO and not outside of the WTO. And we also think that if we're going to get meaningful results, then it has to be done in the multilateral context. That is the most appropriate place for it to happen. And we also think it's the most likely place where China would agree to some of the things that the United States would like to see happen. There needs to be some wins there, a more holistic approach to some of these fundamental problems. On dispute settlement, I don't think it's realistic to imagine that there would be a standalone solution anytime soon. I think that too is probably part of an institutional reform and a broader package. The other thing I would say about dispute settlement is that I think it's very important as members of the WTO that we manage the narrative. There are aspects of the dispute settlement system that are no longer operating, in particular the appellate body, but there are aspects of the dispute settlement system that do continue to operate. And the one narrative that I actively try to discourage is this notion that there is no point in developing new rules. There is no point in negotiations if there's not a functioning appellate body. And to me, that suggests a real cynicism about rulemaking and why you enter into rulemaking. That's not to say that binding dispute settlement is not important. And for Canada, the dispute settlement system is incredibly important. But I think we need to be careful in how we describe this, particularly because I don't think there'll be a solution anytime soon, even though Canada would very much like a solution. But we need to figure out ways to move forward, and we need to control the narrative, because we do enter into rulemaking even if, or in the absence of dispute settlement, because we think rules in and of themselves are a good thing.
I mean, there clearly is that link between the rulemaking function and the dispute settlement function of the WTO. So again, thanks for drawing that out here. Let me now turn to Alfredo Carrillo Obregon, who's been waiting very patiently, and then Vasuki Shastri.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thanks Ambassador DeBoer and Ms. Coke Hamilton for your for your discussion in this on these very important issues. I have a question about a particular issue that has been making headlines in the US and I'm sure around the world this week regarding the United States' support for negotiations on a vaccine waiver at the WTO. And my question is, if you think, I'm in the thought, and I want to know if you think this as well, that discussions on this issue and the disagreements that have started to emerge already could prolong that discussion at the WTO and distract from the other very important issues that you have raised in this presentation, and that such delay and a prolongation of these negotiations could in turn lead to a situation in which the WTO is very visibly seen as not being responsive to the challenges that the world is currently facing. And if you think that such a situation is possible, that this risk is indeed possible, how do WTO members avoid this from happening?
Thank you. And let me just bring in another question before I turn to Visuki, because we have an anonymous attendee that's raising a specific question on the Ottawa Group's initiative on WTO reform and efforts with regarding to the vaccine. To what extent are recent protectionist measures, again, in relation to vaccines by some of the WTO members, undermining some of the efforts of the Ottawa Group's broader WTO reform initiatives, but also specifically, I assume, on the trade and health initiative. But yeah, let's perhaps take those two together, and then Visuki, please.
Yes, thank you, Marianne. The question I had is, the OECD now is putting the finishing touches to both the global minimum corporate tax, now that the US has said it agrees with this idea, as well as the Digital Services Act. And I just wondered, what potential role can the WTO play in these two discussions, mainly considering that developing countries have an equal stake in ensuring that there are no tax leakages, that they benefit from multinational corporations paying their due share of taxes. And the concern really is the OECD kind of is going to stitch this up and have a global agreement without the voice and representation of developing and emerging countries. I just wanted, and since the US imposed retaliatory tariffs against France last year during the Trump administration, when France attempted to impose a digital tax. So there is a trade dimension to this. What role can a multilateral institution play in ensuring that there are fair rules on these two taxes?
Thanks, Visuki. Stephen, let's kick off with you.
Oh, my body language of holding my head is was not a cue. I wanted Pamela to go first. Okay, so on this last question, tax policy and taxes themselves are, well, to a certain extent, the WTO deals with them, but this is new. This is new territory. But I would say that multilateral approaches on these questions would be welcome, particularly around the digital questions, because there is an equity issue here, and it also might inform the e-commerce moratorium discussions that continue in the WTO context. You quite rightly point out that the OECD is essentially a rich country club, and so the OECD doesn't have neither the moral or legal authority to impose these ideas on the broader world. And so who does, and how do we go about doing that? But I can imagine significant wins for everyone if there is this harmonization across the board, because tax policy can be used to create or to exacerbate inequalities, absolutely. So I take the point, but it will be a question of finding the home. But here it's interesting. On the one hand, as you point out, the U.S. has threatened retaliatory tariffs, but they're also the Biden administration, I think, is showing some leadership on these questions. So maybe it's two steps forward and one step back. On the question of protectionist measures, this is a challenge in the WTO in the context of the pandemic. I do think, and Canada made and I made a fairly lengthy intervention at the General Council on Thursday. Perhaps it was a bit too academic for the General Council, but the way that we've looked at export controls and GATT Article 11 is probably out of sync with the way that the world currently operates. I think an important first step, and one thing that we've learned out of this, is the need for transparency and the need for these export controls, if we're going to have them, to be very targeted, to be time limited, all of these things. So the pandemic has been a very good opportunity to talk about the export control regime and what is permitted by the rules. And so from the Ottawa Group perspective, we don't like these export controls, but this is a really good opportunity to have that discussion. The Ottawa Group proposal, which is now broader than the Ottawa Group, there's now 10 non-Ottawa Group members that are supporting this as well. I mean, it comes out of the current pandemic, but it assumes future pandemics. And I'm not saying that because we like the idea of future pandemics, but we can imagine that this will not be the only pandemic. And so we're very much trying to look at this and say, what have we learned? What's good, what's bad, and how do we move forward? So yes, there have been protectionist measures, but the Ottawa Group initiative is meant to look at those and say, was that the right policy response? And how do we discipline that going forward? To Alfredo's question, I would say there is a serious risk of the vaccine discussion, the waiver discussion taking over the playing field when it comes to access to vaccines. And that's why the Ottawa Group proposal on trade and health is broader than vaccines, and the DG herself is very much engaging in a broader discussion. Her third way, where she's engaging with industry, is something that Canada very much supports, because this is a very important discussion to have. It's innovative for a WTO DG to be doing this. It's exactly what we think a WTO DG should be doing. And so we need to have a much broader conversation. Canada will engage in this discussion on a waiver, but we will continue to engage on the other aspects of this. And what's interesting as well is members like Canada, the DG herself, are saying we need to address the pandemic at MC12. We need to talk about trade and health. She's not saying we need a waiver by MC12, and a waiver might be part of that. But yes, there is a risk, and we will be vigilant to make sure that the discussion is broader than simply the waiver.
Pamela, did you want to come in on trade and health and any final concluding thoughts in perhaps a minute?
Yeah, I know that we're closing out. I do want to say on the export control issue that transparency is important. But I did actually say that the pandemic, and I agree with Stephen, has been a great proving ground and a great opportunity to open up the discussion on this. Because in a sense, it proved that the WTO was actually very important. Because if there was no other mechanism for these notifications to be made, it would have been mass chaos across the world. Mass, because nobody would have known. And so at least we can prove that the WTO in that context actually served a purpose. It was not as good as we would have wanted it to be, but it was there. And I think that is a really critical thing to note and to see how we can improve on that. On the issue of the waiver, I think the US's statement or commitment is a great symbolic gesture. In the short term, I'm not sure how effective it will be in terms of actually helping to address the issue, which is the distribution of vaccines and getting vaccines into countries. But at least it suggests an openness to negotiating for a more equitable approach to vaccine distribution. And I think in the final analysis, my final point would be that, at the end of the day, what we're supposed to be all doing here, as far as for me anyway, why I'm here, is, what's my purpose in life, is to see how can we improve the lives of others? How can what we're doing ensure that my son and his kids and our children and grandchildren can actually live in a better world? And that's what this is about. And to the extent that we can pursue that, then I think that's what we need to do. Thanks.
Thank you. And I think both of you have really highlighted that there is this need to move forward on 21st century trade issues such as digital trade, but also climate change. But at the same time, that the WTO and its members don't lose sight of some of the unresolved challenges of 20th century trade, whether it's agriculture, development, etc. And I think the key challenge is also, how do you bring the WTO members on board of WTO reform when there's still very much divergences on key positions, again, areas of development, special and differential treatment, we didn't even touch upon that, but again, a lot of issues there that are, again, raising questions about what does it actually mean to move forward on reform and different perspectives from the members. So this has been a very wide-ranging discussion. I really appreciate both of you taking your time and sharing your insights with us. Stephen and Pamela, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks also to our participants and to our funders, AIG, Diageo, Clifford Chance, and UPS. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marian. Thanks.
You're very welcome.
Everybody. Thanks, Stephen.